Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. So today what we're going to be doing is covering how to apply for a postdoc position. Maybe you're more senior and you're about to apply for a postdoc position, or maybe you're more junior and you're thinking about what do I need in order to be successful in the future when I do apply for a postdoc position. In either case, I think that you're going to find this video to be helpful, or at least I hope so. So what is the process and what should you do and so forth. So I think the first thing that anyone that is ready to be applying for a postdoc position should do is that they should update their CV. This is the most important thing. You're going to be needing to send your CV out, and this is also going to help you in some other ways. So what are some things that are important to have on your CV? So of course your education. I would definitely include any papers that you've published or that are in press or that are in preparation. What you need to do is you need to demonstrate to your future PI that you're applying to join their lab that you have some level of productivity. And the easiest way to judge that is how much you've published. The next thing you need to do is add in presentations that you've given, highlight any awards that you've won, highlight any grants that you've received. You need to highlight anything that you could think of, even experimental techniques. Sometimes PIs like to hire people that are in slightly different fields because they have an area of expertise that is not the same as their lab. So as an example, I work in a lab that deals with brown adipose tissue and energy metabolism. That's the research that I do. We recently hired a new postdoc that specializes in medicinal chemistry. He basically does analytical chemistry, specifically with lipids. But we don't have anyone in the lab that could do that, and it's very important for some of the research areas that our lab is endeavoring right now. So highlighting your techniques that you specialize in, it helps to market yourself. And I strongly suggest having your PI and other committee members read over your CV and ask for feedback, constructive feedback. Really ask, what can I do to make my CV more appealing? Now, when you apply for a postdoc, your CV is obviously not going to be as long as your PI's, and it's going to look a little different, and that's fine. What you need to do is highlight your skills, so experimental, and your productivity. What have you done in graduate school? Now, this is important for another reason, and the second reason is it's going to help you assess where you should be applying for a postdoc. So this is something that you and your PI should definitely discuss. Where is it appropriate for you to be looking? If you haven't published anything, you've done one seminar at an obscure conference, and you don't have a lot else to put on your CV, applying for a position at Harvard is just not realistic, and it's not worth wasting your time. The PIs at Harvard get hundreds of applications for postdocs. So if you're going to spend time applying there, you should at least have a realistic chance of getting a position there. So after you've completed your CV, you should sit down with your PI and you should discuss where is it appropriate to apply for a postdoc. And what I mean by where is it appropriate, that takes into account two things. The first thing is the institute. The second thing is the field. So the institute is going to be sort of determined by how your CV looks and the lab that you're coming from. So if you're coming from a well-respected lab, you could lack a little bit in the CV. If you're coming from a less known lab, you have to have an even more stellar CV. And you need to assess the field. So do you want to stay in a field that's the exact same? So if you're in cancer biology and you're currently studying breast cancer, do you want to stay in breast cancer? Do you even want to stay in cancer? Do you want to move to metabolism? So a good example is when I did my PhD, I was in an aging lab, but I did aging research that was related to metabolism, and I decided that I didn't quite want to continue in aging because I felt I already had an okay background. What I wanted to do was get a better feel for metabolism, so I switched to a metabolism lab. And that's totally fine. People switch fields. Sometimes people switch fields completely. So you need to kind of decide where you want to go. And when you're doing this, you need to keep a couple of things in mind. The work that you do as a grad student is very important, and it really sets you up for understanding how to do research. But the work that you do as a postdoc, That's the work that you're going to take with you if you go into academics. So knowing what field you're in is very important. The other thing is the PI that you're going to. You want to go to a lab that has a well-respected PI, and we're going to get into that in a minute. So you've updated your CV, and you've sat down with your PI and said, this is kind of the area of research that I want to go in, and this is kind of the type of institute that I'm looking at. And you might need to keep in mind a couple different institutes in that area. So are you going to go to a tier 1 school like a Harvard or a Stanford, a tier 2 school like a University of Michigan, or a tier 3 school? So these are things to keep in mind. Once you've done that, you need to pick appropriate mentors. So what do I look for, or what should you look for when you're applying for a postdoc? Well, the first thing is how many postdocs are in that lab. So there are labs that have no postdocs, 1 postdoc. There's some that are mid-size that have 5 or 6, and then there are some that have more than 10 postdocs. This is important for a few reasons. The first reason is how much attention can your PI give you. If you're somebody that's going to need a lot of hand-holding or a lot of attention, you don't want to go to a lab with 10 postdocs in it, because quite frankly, you're not going to get that level of attention. The PI only has so many hours in a day, and they have other postdocs and other commitments that they have to worry about. So my lab, I have 7 postdocs altogether in this lab. I'm one of 7, and I get to meet with my PI infrequently sometimes, but really I get 1 hour a week to meet with her. That's about it. Now, I'm okay with that, but not everybody is okay with that. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is of the postdocs that they have, and again, this is going to vary if they have 1 or 2 or if they have 10. The postdocs that they've had, how successful have they been? Do they publish in high impact journals? Do they secure grants? Do they find faculty positions or positions in industry or at NIH, wherever you want to go? If you want to go to industry and your goal is to go to industry, but you apply to person X's lab because they publish good papers and they all get academic positions, well, that may not be the best fit because that PI doesn't have experience getting her postdocs or his postdocs into industry. So you need to find a postdoc that has a proven track record for what your specific goals are. So my specific goal is to eventually have my own lab. So when I applied for postdocs, I looked at PIs that had postdocs that successfully published in high impact papers, and in high impact journals. PIs that had postdocs that successfully secured F and K level funding, and postdocs that successfully transitioned into independent faculty members, because that's what my goal is. If they haven't done that with others, there's no guarantee they'll be able to do it with you. So that's something to keep in mind. So you have gone and you have updated your CV. You've discussed with your PI what field you want to go in and kind of what institute you want to go to, and you guys have come to a consensus. And now you've narrowed down a list of some postdoc positions that you would like to apply for. How do you go about applying? There's 2 ways. The first way is to look at job sites. So if you go to Indeed.com or any of these other job sites, you might see some postdoc positions offered there, or to go to school or department websites that may be advertising that Professor Y or Professor AB is looking for a postdoc position, and these are the qualifications that we're looking for. The second way, which is the way that I took and I think a lot of people take, is to inquire. That is to say, I am interested in joining this person's lab. They don't have anything necessarily listed, but I'm going to send them an email and say, my name is whatever, and I'm interested in joining your lab. This is the way that I went, and I think a lot of people do go. So when you go to send these emails, what should you say? So the first thing you need to do is introduce yourself. Say, my name is Justin, and I'm interested in joining your lab. You need to give some background about yourself. So I come from University X in blank's laboratory, and this is sort of what I studied. And then the most important thing is you need to tie it back to their lab. They're going to get so many people emailing them saying, I want to join your lab. And what it looks like is it's just a general spam email that you sent to 50 different people. You need to tailor it to each person. So my name is John Doe, and I studied breast cancer at UCLA in Dr. JD's lab. My research was in metastasis. I'm interested in joining your lab because you do blank work with metastasis, and I find it really interesting. It could be as simple as that. But what you need to do is let them know that you've at least read some of the papers from their lab and that you have a general idea of what it is that their lab does. That goes such a long way. I cannot stress that enough. If you don't do that, they are very likely to just throw out the email that you sent. You really, really need to stress to them this is what it is, that you're interested in their specific lab. You also need to include your CV, and I would find it useful to also include 3 professional references. So one is going to have to be your PI, and then 2 more, typically people that are on your committee or your grad school advisor or your department chair. But people that are familiar with you and your research would be the best choices. And so then you need to send out to multiple people, and then you have to wait. And what you're going to find is you're going to get different responses. You're going to get some that are going to say, I just don't have funding right now. I'm sorry. And that's fine. Funding is very hard. And so I myself applied, and one lab told me that they didn't quite have funding. So they weren't sure whether they could fund me for the whole amount of time that I wanted to be in their lab. Some will say that they're interested and that they want to interview you. And some may just say no or may not get back to you. And again, that's also fine. Not everybody is going to be accepted to every lab they apply to, even if you're a stellar candidate. For whatever reason, the PI may not need another postdoc. He may not be able to afford another postdoc. He may not even have space for another postdoc. So just keep that in mind and don't take it personally. That's why you're going to apply to more than one. So I would say at least a minimum of 5 places is where you should apply. At least 5. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that this is a process. So once you send out an email, by the time you finally get someone that says, okay, I'm willing to take you for an interview, you go for an interview, they give you a position or offer you a position, and you start a lab, it's going to take time. So don't expect to start applying for postdoc positions and then within a month you have a job. It's not going to go that fast. So give it at least 3, 4, 5, even 6 months time. So also consider that when you're planning your defense, that it's going to take time. Then the last part, of course, then is the interview. And so what does the interview typically consist of? So the interview is going to consist of giving a presentation to the lab, either over Skype or in person. Sometimes the whole department is invited. And then getting to meet with the postdocs that are in the lab and getting to meet with the PI that are in the lab. Now, this is a very important thing. There are questions that you undoubtedly should ask the postdocs in the lab and the PI. And there are so many people I know that are unhappy with the labs that they joined because they did not ask these questions and they wish that they did. I was fortunate enough to have someone give me advice before I went for my interviews, so I knew to ask these questions. So what should you ask of the postdocs first? Let's start there. So the first thing you should obviously ask is, what do you think of life in the lab? And believe me, the postdocs will be very honest with you. I don't think many postdocs that hate life in the lab are going to tell you that it's fantastic. They'll at least give signs that they're unhappy. So kind of look for subtleties in what they say. But for the most part, I think they'll be straightforward. Ask, what is life like in the lab? You know, how many hours a day are you working? Are you often working weekends? Are you often working late at night? What tends to be the expectations of the postdocs in the lab? You know, are you expected to publish a Nature paper in the first couple years? These are important things to ask the postdocs. How does everyone in the lab get along? That's an important one. A lot of times the PI doesn't know how everybody in the lab gets along, and you want to go somewhere that everyone seems to get along. because the last thing you need when you're struggling to get through a postdoc is to have other postdocs in the lab that don't get along, they argue. It just is not a good experience. Ask them, how do you think of your PI compared to other PIs at the Institute? I love my PI, and every postdoc in the lab is going to tell you that our PI is one of our favorite professors in the Institute. If they don't say that, that's not a good sign. If they say, well, my PI is good, but I'd rather go to X or Y's lab instead, I would have gone to their lab. That's not a good sign. You don't want to go to that lab. And then what are things that you need to ask the PI? How long are you able to fund me for? What are your expectations of postdocs? Again, what are their expectations? Do they want you to publish a Nature paper in the first year? Or is it that they want you to publish a paper within the first 3 years? Be realistic about what the expectations are. What are your expectations for me securing funding? So some labs, you don't need to get your own funding. And in other labs, you have about a year to get funding or they're going to ask you to leave. So what are the expectations for funding? Do you compete with postdocs when they leave? This is an important point. You don't want a PI that's going to tell you when you leave that you can't take any of the work that you did, you can't take any of the reagents, you can't take any of the ideas, that it belongs to the lab. That's not good. You want a PI that's going to say when you graduate, or not when you graduate, when you're done with your postdoc, that you can take your ideas and reagents with you, and I'm not going to compete in that area with you. And that is so crucial. So make sure you find out about that beforehand. Ask, what is the success rate with your postdocs in finding the position that they want? How can you help me if I have trouble with X or Y? Ask these questions. They'll be honest with you. And it's going to go a long way into ensuring that you really are in the best position for you. And what I want to stress by that, everybody wants to go to Harvard or Stanford, etc. for their postdoc, but that's not going to be the best position for everybody. Example, at Harvard, most people have to have their own funding, but if you're not quite ready enough yet to secure your own funding, it's not going to be a successful time for you. Some people need to have someone that can teach them experiments because they are a little slower learning experimental techniques, and that's fine. But if you're in a big lab with a lot of postdocs, the PI is not going to have time to teach you techniques. You're going to have to learn on your own or rely on other postdocs. So knowing what your needs are, you need to ask specific questions to the PI that you're thinking about joining their lab to make sure that you get the most out of the lab that you go to. And that's about it for this video. I really hope that this helps. This is a very individual topic. Everyone has their own needs and wants in a lab. I wanted to go to a top institute in a top lab that publishes top papers. And I know a lot of people do, but there's also a lot of people that would like to go there but don't quite have, not the skill set, but there's different things that are not readily apparent to them. So there are people that don't do well in big labs. They thrive in a smaller lab environment. Going to Harvard, you won't find a small lab environment, and you might be more successful in a different institute with a smaller lab. And there are other institutes than Harvard. That's a very important thing to stress. Just because you don't go to Harvard or Stanford or UCLA is not the end of the world. You could be a successful postdoc at many institutes. And I will stress that the lab that you come from is just as important as the institute itself. You need to look for a PI as well. It's better to go to a big name person in a tier 2 school than to go to a tier 1 school with a brand new PI that just got their first R01. So keep that in mind. But overall, I hope that this helps clear up some of the stuff that you're going to need to accomplish. So just to recap, the first thing you need to do is get your CV in order. The second step is you need to talk to your PI and kind of come to a consensus about what's appropriate to you. You need to send out applications, have good interviews, and again, Hopefully your PI will be able to help you to prepare for these interviews and practice your presentations. And then you need to ask the right questions of both the postdocs in the lab and the PI whose lab you're thinking about joining. And again, I really can't stress this enough. You need to think about what is best for you. Every person that's applying for a postdoc is different. But I promise you, there are so many postdocs out there. There are postdocs available for everybody. There are even postdocs in industry, at NIH. There's all kinds of opportunities out there. You really need to think about what is best for you. So with that, thank you again for watching the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.